Hello, everybody. Welcome to our session today. My name is Ali Garrett, and I am the CX Director at Isentia. Thank you so much for joining us today and giving us one of your December afternoons. I know that that can be a very precious time of year, so we're really happy to have you join us. We've got a big question to interrogate today and a fantastic panel, so I will get cracking fairly shortly. But I did just want to let you know that for all of our participants who've joined us, your microphones are muted today, but that doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. We'd love to hear your questions, and we'll have time at the end of the session. And the best place to ask a question to any of our panelists today is in the GoToWebinar chat area. So you should be able to find that on your navigation panel. So I reckon let's get into it. I'm going to introduce you to our panelists today. So who we have in the session today, I'm Ali, I'm the CX Director at Isentia. I'll be trying to guide this ship and making sure we have some excellent conversation. I'm also joined by the Staff Editor-in-Chief, Patrick Crewdson. So Patrick has worked at the Herald on Sunday for its launch. Then he moved to the Dominion Post, where he worked as a reporter and a web editor, and he was there for 4 years of the head of news. And Patrick has been the staff editor since 2014, and in his work there, he has prioritised quality journalism, multimedia innovation, and climate change coverage. So good afternoon, Patrick. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
No worries. We've also got Gautam Mishra with us here today, and Gautam is the CEO of Inkle. And I've heard Inkle be described as the Spotify of news. And if that isn't bang on, I'm sure Gautam will let me know. So for those of you who haven't used Inkle before, Inkle is a premium curated news service that unlocks articles from the world's best news titles. And before Inkle, Gautam was the Director of Strategy, Data and Research at Fairfax, and there he launched and ran the online subscriptions for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. We've also got veteran journalist Sean Aylmer with us today, and Sean is the presenter of the business podcast Fear and Greed. And Sean is also one of Australia's most experienced and respected journalists. Sean was editorial director of the ASX listed Fairfax Media, which means he was the most senior journalist in the Fairfax group. He's also been a political correspondent in Canberra, a foreign correspondent in New York, and an economist in a previous life with the Reserve Bank of Australia. And Sean is now presenting the Fear and Greed podcast with episodes dropping every morning at 6:30 a.m. Rounding out the panel, we've got
Ali,
Ngaire.
I'm going to jump in. I've also got a son downstairs that has decided to drill whilst I'm on a webinar. I'll be back in 30 seconds.
Fabulous. That is the most 2020 thing ever. We're all doing this session from our home today. So thank you for letting me know. I'll introduce Ngaire while we keep going. Ngaire is our Insights Director for Australia and New Zealand for Isentia. And so that means that Ngaire runs our Media Research Division. She's also the chair of the Global Young Leaders Group for AMAC. So that is the International Association for the Measurement and Evaluation of Communications. And she is a passionate advocate for communications research. So what I'd like to start by doing today is having a think about our question. Today we're going to interrogate how 2020 has changed the media landscape. We've had a truly unprecedented year. What is it that is here to stay? What is it that is just a flash in the pan? And for our audience today, we've got a lot of professional communicators tuning in. What is it that they need to know to get ready for next year? So Sean, I know you've just done a little bit of a dash downstairs, so I'm not sure if you were ready for the first question. But
I'm puffing.
When it comes, you're puffing, I'll talk a little bit
slower.
No,
that's all right. No, I'm right to go.
If we're talking about adapting to new mediums, new delivery of news, you've launched a podcast in the middle of a pandemic that launched in May. Can you tell us about that process? What has it been like launching a podcast in the middle of a global life-altering pandemic?
It's been fun. It's been hard work, but it's kind of the best of times and worst of times. The thing about a pandemic and everything that falls out of it, the economics of it particularly, is that everyone wants the news. Everyone is following the news cycle. So in many ways, if you're launching a news product and you can somehow get cut through and create a brand and build an audience, it's actually a great time to do it. Now, in our instance, Fear and Greed is a commuters podcast, and the challenge of launching a commuter podcast in April this year is that there were no commuters for the rest of the year. So it was sort of the worst of times in that sense as well. But I think when the news cycle is as it is, has been in 2020, and everyone was craving for news, in many ways for me, it was a great time to launch it. And because we had a little bit of, I think we were really hard to start without any reputation whatsoever, but because the guys involved in it had a bit of reputation and we could spread the word a bit, I think that was very beneficial. If I was starting fresh in 2020 and no one knew who any of us was, I think it'd almost be impossible to get cut through, to be honest.
What do your days look like in 2020? You've got those commuting episodes in the morning and the afternoon wrap, right? So do you sleep producing 2 podcast episodes a day? What does it look like?
I have a new appreciation for radio, guys. One of the team was Ray Hadley's long-term producer, and Michael Thompson, his name is, he literally lives on 4 hours sleep, which I can't quite do. My day for Fear and Greed starts at about 4:30 in the afternoon, and that's a fairly quick look at what's happened. And we do an afternoon report, which is 5:30. I spend a couple of hours at night, say 7 till 9. Then I get up about 4 in the morning, and then we record about 5:30 or so. So there's probably 3.5 to 4 hours of preparation for it. The podcast is deliberately, we're not trying to break news, we're really trying to explain news. That's what it's about. We also have an interview every day, and I think in total we must be close to 18 episodes a week. So it's a lot of work, but it's my thing. It's my shtick, my cup of tea, so I love it.
It's interesting to me that you mentioned that change in commuter behaviour, because at Isentia we've actually noticed that use of our app or growth of our app has slowed down. And when we did a little bit of research into it, it was like, this is a no-brainer. People aren't commuting anymore. People are not rushing to meetings in the same way, or at least they haven't been this year. I know that things are getting back to normal. Gautam, I'm interested in what you've noticed in changing audience behaviour this year, changing consumer behaviour. What have you noticed in your inkl customer base and in the world that you work in?
Sure. Look, I think from our perspective, a lot of the changes we've seen this year were already in train. I'd say there's probably been an acceleration in a lot of the trends that we've already starting to see. The first one obviously being that this was a global pandemic, so I think people's news interests have broadened. It's been a lot more about what's happening in the US and China and Europe and elsewhere, not just what's happening in Australia. I think the second one is there was a lot of misinformation. And again, I think, 7 years ago, there was this idea that you could trust the news on Facebook because your family and friends would share it with you. And what we found is your family and friends are actually the least reliable people to get your news from. So there's been a lot of interest in really going out of Facebook and going out of Twitter and going to more vetted, verified, reliable sources of information, particularly because, the stakes are so high and the situation was developing and no one really had all the facts. So it was important that even if there were mistakes made, that you were getting the news from organizations that at least were not willfully misleading, and if they made a mistake, they would correct the record. I think the other shift from the publisher's perspective is they've obviously had to accelerate their push into subscriptions. Ad revenue for publishers was, I guess it was declining already, but we've seen that again accelerate. And so we've seen a lot more paywalls go up around the world. We have readers, in 193 countries. And so we end up speaking to publishers all over the world. And as recently as maybe 18 months ago, when I'd speak to the guys in India, they were not thinking about paywalls at all because desktop was growing and print was growing and mobile was growing and life was grand. But even in places like India, Indonesia, the Philippines, where you might consider there is a lower willingness to pay, a lower price point, even in those markets now, the publishers have sort of said, well, maybe we charge less, but we have to have a subscription model. So really, I think, there's been this big acceleration of trends that were already in place. and a lot of it is underpinned by a growing interest and growing demand for news, as Sean was saying.
Yeah, absolutely. Even myself as a news consumer, I've felt that growing demand for news, and it's felt like I've spent half the year plugged into a live blog or daily press conferences. I've been thinking a little bit about this expectation to see everything, where press conferences are daily, they're streamed in their entirety, there are questions and answers. Those journalists can become quite exposed on Twitter. Patrick, I was curious in your thoughts on what does that expectation to see everything mean for the industry? Is that something you think is here to stay? What are your thoughts on that?
So I think it creates a two-tiered expectation. So one is that our audience now expects an unfiltered experience, just like you were saying. They expect to be seeing those daily 1 p.m. press conference, 1 p.m. in New Zealand, with the Director General of Health, who's become enough of a celebrity that has his face on tea towels. So they expect to be able to see those 1 p.m. press conferences live and direct and unmediated, really. But very few people come out of the end of those press conferences thinking, every question I had has been answered adequately. So beyond that initial unfiltered direct feed, there's then a huge appetite for the analysis and the interpretation and the digging that finds answers to the inconvenient questions. So I think it's an additional expectation that our audience now has of being able to, to a certain degree, being in the room that previously the journalist was in by themselves, and now the public is a participant in that room as well. But it doesn't mean that that's all they need. It's still incumbent on us to be doing in-depth reporting behind that.
Yeah, absolutely. And is that a trend that you think is very much here to stay, or is that something that winds back as we see COVID wind back globally?
I think in New Zealand at least, we've seen the same thing applied to smaller news stories as the year has gone on. So nothing else matches the gigantic scale of COVID-19 as a all-encompassing news story, but with the New Zealand election, with this week here, the release of the Royal Commission report into the Christchurch terrorist attacks from 2019, today with anniversary commemorations of the eruption at Whakaari White Island, each time there's an expectation that there are live events happening, there are press conferences, and we'll be carrying those live and in full.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you for explaining that. If we stay in my homeland of New Zealand for a little bit longer, in late November, Stuff issued an apology for their past reporting and their depiction of Māori people. And this is a really significant event for the media landscape in New Zealand. I want to ask you about it, Patrick, but first, Ngaire, I wanted to ask you, as a media researcher, what media trends have you noticed in response to this apology? An apology where Stuff apologised for behaviour that they themselves in the past labelled as racist.
Yeah, I think as a media researcher, as someone who has built my career on media research, because I'm incredibly passionate about representation, I should acknowledge that I have a huge bias in this story. I care about representation, and I also care a lot about radical transparency. So I believe that good communication comes from being authentic and honest and transparent. So I obviously observed it with a lot of interest. I think it says something really interesting about commercial models and the infusion of values into commercial models, and that there's increasing demand from audiences that organisations stand for something and that they contribute to the world. And I think that the application of that to media is really interesting. Social media is always going to be a really interesting way of looking at extreme reaction. I think, and I'm sure Patrick and his colleagues experienced the full gamut of reactions to that event. There was the spectrum of this is far too woke, to those that were a little bit indifferent and really wanted to see what this looked like in the long term, and then those that view it as an incredibly positive first step. I think from my perspective, this is more of a longer term view on how you would see this as successful. It's now's kind of the hard part. The first step is done, obviously trying to prove that behaviour change, maintaining a new standard, owning up when it hasn't quite gone right in real time. And most importantly, I mean, I personally believe that it will show that you can operate in a commercially viable way while holding to some level of core belief that evolve and change with the audiences that you're serving.
Awesome. Patrick, what has the response to that apology in late November been like for you personally, but also for the organisation?
Well, firstly, people noticed. And our greatest fear in advance was, what if we do this and nobody cares and it doesn't make any noise? And people noticed, so that was great. The staff who led it, our editorial director, Mark Stevens, and Carmen Parahi, our Potiaki editor, they had led a team of reporters who had spent months going back over, samples of 160 years of our newspaper coverage. And the results they came out with were pretty damning. They showed that we were at best monocultural, at worst racist, and sometimes just really openly racist. And actually sometimes racist in quite recent history. Going into it was probably obvious to think that 140 years ago newspapers would have taken attitudes that today they wouldn't. But actually some of our recent coverage was pretty uncomfortable and confronting to review as well. Once we realised that people had noticed and were responding, I personally had expected mainly negative feedback because usually people are quick to complain and slow to praise, and that's just the way it is. You hear from the people who don't like something. And we did. We heard from the people who didn't like it. And like you said, the word woke was applied very often. PC. Some people I think were offended because they felt that we were calling them racist rather than holding ourselves to account for our own previous coverage. But the thing that surprised me was that positive feedback outweighed the negative by about 2 to 1, which I guess spoke to how this really affected a lot of our readership and a lot of people who weren't our readership. And part of doing this project was thinking, Stuff is the biggest news website in New Zealand. We have our audience is the closest thing to a mirror of the population, but it's more Pākehā, it's whiter than the population overall. And thinking about why that is, we realised that there was a chunk of a potential audience who was just turned off us and not willing to give us a chance because of the way we had reported on their communities previously. And so a project like this kind of opens the door again. We've had people turning up in our offices, sitting down with our reporters, and this happened in our New Plymouth office in Taranaki. Local iwi leader came into the office, wanted to meet with the editor and the reporters afterwards, sat down with them, and then had to spend about 10 minutes composing herself before she could speak because she was so moved by what had happened. And we've had that reaction from a lot of Maori readers and a lot of Pākehā readers. So I think looking back on it now, we would consider it a huge success, actually.
Yeah, that's what you've just described is so significant. And as someone who has been in Australia for almost 10 years, I'm really interested in your thoughts, Sean, and then I'll ask you for your thoughts on a global level, Gautam, as well, because I know you're working with publishers globally. Is the process that Patrick just described something that we can envision happening in Australia? What does this increasing importance of ethics in the landscape of Black Lives Matter, climate change, what does it mean? Sean, do you think this could happen in Australia?
Well, we had a great example. I think it was 2013. I was the editor-in-chief of the Sydney Morning Herald, and I may get some of the details wrong here, but effectively it was someone representing someone who had been arrested at the first ever gay and lesbian Mardi Gras in Sydney, which I think was about 1978, the late 70s. We had reported it back then and said Joe Blow from Billy Street, Redfern, was arrested for, and they came and said, you owe us an apology because Joe Blow, or whoever it was targeted as a result of us putting his name in the paper. Now, in 1978, the Sydney Morning Herald, whenever they reported on anyone being arrested, the way we did it was Jane from William Street, wherever, Narrabeen. And so we weren't actually doing anything different in that instance. But and we did apologise for it, and as we should have. And I think that the process for me as the editor, as much as anything, it changed the way we thought about how we report on sort of LG issues generally. And I think that's probably what we got as much as anything. As I stood there in 2013 and looked at what we did in 1978, it was outrageous. How could we ever do that? So we have a different perspective now, but I think the great thing for that was that it sort of opened our eyes to how we should be thinking about it. And I'm sure there's lots of issues that the media reports and I report on personally, which in 10 or 20 years I'll look back on and think, I can't believe that I thought about the environment that way. I thought about fossil fuels that way, or some sort of topic like that. And it is an evolution. It's really hard. And I think what Stuff.co did and what Patrick's talked about is incredibly honourable. But you won't please everyone, and some will say you haven't done enough, and others will be delighted. But I think we all have to just keep moving along that path to get there. And a lot of it comes down to politics and who's in power and how you're covering politicians and that type of thing. And so when you're covering, climate change is a great example. You're covering climate change under Tony Abbott, you were still talking about whether the science was real or not. You're covering climate change under Scott Morrison, no one's arguing about the science anymore, right? It's about how you're actually going to achieve your 2050 targets. So I think that's sort of a long-winded answer, but I think we're evolving. I don't think it's ever going to be a static situation. And so long as we as the media always look to improve, and what Stuff did was fantastic, like full stop. And maybe we'll have to do it again in 5 or 10 years, and I'm sure most of us will, but that's what's important.
Well, but I'll just add, if I can, part of what we've done, Sean, which is a little bit frightening in some ways, is by doing this so publicly, we've invited our audience to continue to hold us to account for that. So you're absolutely right. It'll be an evolution, and I think on quite a quick timescale in some ways. When we get it wrong now, they know that they'll get in touch with us.
Awesome.
Better than being ignored.
It is. A conversation is better than being ignored. Before we move on to talk about misinformation, I just wanted your thoughts on that, Gautam. What are you seeing on a global level about that evolution, the relationship between ethics and journalism and that responsibility?
There's probably two ways that we've been discussing this within the business. One is around this idea of the Overton window, which is essentially an acceptable spectrum of ideas or beliefs around which a societal consensus is constructed. And what we're seeing is that the Overton window, which I think to a large extent people thought of as a static construct, has really started to shift around, right? In some places it's expanded, in some places it's lurched all the way over to the left or to the right. And as that's happened, I think you find people getting more uncomfortable. You have people on the left saying this is too far to the right. You have people on the right saying this is too far to the left. And it's really because this notion of what's acceptable and what we all commonly believe has started to change quite rapidly. And I think that's a natural evolution of people having more of a voice. It's exactly what Patrick and Sean were talking about, right? When the conversation was more unidirectional, there was more consensus in that message. I mean, it wasn't really a conversation, right? So the messages were, I guess, less varied. Now that there's a lot more traffic coming back the other way, you get a much greater variety of responses, and that shifts this idea of the Overton window and where acceptable ideas lie. The other thing that's changed as well is, I think, the way that publishers position themselves in the market. So 10 years ago, when the dominant model was advertising, the game was really about getting out there to cover the same story with largely the same facts as everybody else, but doing it first. And getting there first so you could get the traffic benefit, right? You could get the largest number of page views. That's obviously changed quite dramatically as publishers have pushed more towards building their own relationships and paid relationships with subscribers. And so what we've seen across the board is that publishers are starting to try and differentiate themselves more by taking a more overt stance on specific issues. And as that's happened, again, we've seen a greater variety of views in the market. And so I think that all contributes to this idea that there is a greater diversity in the conversation. Ultimately, I think it's all actually really helpful. It's just, I think it's a matter of time, for people to get comfortable with the idea that not everyone's going to agree with you on everything. And, we have to, I think, as a global society, think about what happens when we don't achieve consensus on certain ideas. How do we learn to agree to disagree?
I think agreeing to disagreeing leads me into my next point rather well. What I wanted us to talk a little bit about was the intersection between two massive global events this year: the US election, the COVID pandemic, and both of those stories have seen a rise in conversation about misinformation, disinformation. Gautam, you were talking before about friends and family, Facebook arguably being a dangerous place to get your news from. Ngaire, I wanted to throw to you, what research trends are you seeing when it comes to the idea of trust, the idea of misinformation?
Yeah, I think conspiracy theories and misinformation and disinformation, as it can now be termed as well, they've always existed. They now just live in a more amplified and politicized environment. So, and it's also at the moment to a global audience that are currently experiencing an event all at the same time and watching how everybody is responding. From a communications perspective, what we've seen in an era of misinformation is just that it is incredibly important, and most communicators do know this, to build trust in audience as well as you can before a crisis. You need to be able to brand and centralize your information so that you are considered a source of truth, and it's harder to replicate your information. It has to be part of a crisis plan. One of the things that we're looking at the moment is really around the potential impact of the media amplification of misinformation, not so much the misinformation itself, but the fact that the misinformation exists. We saw a lot, especially during COVID, of there were examples of media quite aggressively going after people that they believed had the wrong idea, and whether or not that actually resonates and changes anybody's mind, because that's part of the scheme that these people are often rebelling against or don't inherently believe in the first place. And the other kind of second level here is around news literacy, and I think it was mentioned before around friends and family aren't the most reliable sources of news. When we're actually doing a lot of audience research, we constantly ask people how they find information. Not so much why do you feel that way, but where did you hear that? More common than any other source is, I just believe that, or someone told that to me. So there is still this disconnection between people understanding what news looks like currently, how you would fact check it, whether or not there's any desire to do so. There's also there's that really interesting layer to it as well that we're starting to dig into.
So in this world of I just believe it or somebody told me, I'm interested in hearing from all of you on the panel about your role in counteracting misinformation. Patrick and Gautam and Sean, you all work in very different roles in the media industry, but I'm interested in what you see as being your responsibility counteracting misinformation. Do you feed the conspiracy theories? Sean, what does that look like for you?
Look, I think you've got to believe that in the end, people will head towards news that's true. There's lots of misinformation around. I think what you're seeing in Australia at the moment with code of conduct and things like that for Facebook and Google is sort of an attempt to regulate that to some extent, and obviously pay the media companies for the content that that they provide an audience for. But I think people do self-regulate, and over time, Donald Trump, everyone read Donald Trump's tweets, and then well before Twitter decided to put disclaimers on it, people have stopped believing Donald Trump's tweets, because I think people do regulate around it. Personally, Fear and Greed, we try and give the news every day. We try and give an explanation for it. We don't particularly want to be left or right, though I'm sure that someone would, to Gautam's point earlier on, someone will look at me and say, he's a bit right wing, isn't he? Or what a lefty. And that's just reflecting on where they're coming from. It's best effort. And I think we're probably all, if you're serious about journalism and serious about content, you have to do best efforts to make it straight down the line. Having said that, if you're a radio guy, right, you want to be lefty or you want to be a righty. I watched the US presidential election and I kept switching between Fox and CNN because, God, it was good fun comparing what CNN was saying and what Fox was saying. And Fox was the one that called, was it Nevada or one of the Arizona, one of those states before everyone else. And then they were trying to back down. And so, there's an entertainment value in news too, which we probably shouldn't undersell.
Patrick, what about you? What's your role in counteracting that misinformation?
I guess to some degree, you hope that by upholding professional standards and ethics of accuracy and fairness and balance, that you're doing, that there's not nothing when it comes to preserving trust and to combating misinformation. We run, during the New Zealand election, we had an initiative called The Whole Truth, which was a fact-checking enterprise that we created. So we hope that kind of thing helps, illuminate. Where it gets really tricky is what Ngaire was talking about earlier, about when you attack misinformation head on, or when doing so is counterproductive because it amplifies it. So one example is late in our election campaign, our investigative unit Stuff Circuit published a documentary called False Prophet about a politician here called Billy Tikahika, who had risen to a substantial level of social media popularity, at least, and had taken in a large amount of money in public donations with some, what you might charitably call QAnon adjacent policies. Very strong conspiracy vein. And this was a factual but very strong documentary that showed that he wasn't who he claimed to be. And we felt that was the right approach for that story because it was someone who was standing for political office, had some momentum behind them, was selling out venues all around the country, was getting a large amount of money in donations. On the other hand, late in New Zealand's lockdown period in April, there was a series of rumours that spread everywhere, and it seemed that everybody in the country knew them from Facebook, about the government's response to COVID and specifically military action that was going to be taken. And it was common knowledge. Everybody knew these things. They were wrong, and by coincidence, not by design, all other New Zealand media outlets deliberately didn't publish them, even to debunk them, because we felt that would have the effect of amplifying them. But I think that's a really tricky course that we're still steering our way through.
Yeah, absolutely. And Gautam, your role is slightly different, offering a compressed content service from multiple different publishers. What's your take on this? What role do you have in the service?
I think I mean, look, in our view, I think there's someone once said that lies will travel all the way around the world while the truth's still tying its shoelaces, right? And so to a certain extent, I think our view is that you have to try and get ahead of this, right? If you're going to try and chase behind a fake news story, you're never going to get caught up. And so you have to go to the root source and you have to say, well, why is this coming up in the first place? And for me, this was actually one of the reasons to start Inkle, because I felt and still feel very strongly that, you cannot use social media as a news platform. And I'll tell you why. There's a couple of sort of actual structural reasons why I think that's the case. But I really felt that we needed a platform at global scale, because you've got to give people an alternative, right? And if you see someone living in a house made of asbestos, it's all well and good to tell them, well, you got to get out of that house, but you got to give them somewhere to go. And so for us, it was creating this alternative destination where you could actually go and get verified information. And the key difference for us is that verification occurs at the source. When you create a platform like Facebook, which by definition does two things. One is it's an open platform, so everybody can have a voice. You automatically have this issue where you have people who are not there just to inform. You have, in fact, there's a very interesting difference between misinformation and disinformation, which is the idea of, intent, right? And so you not only have people making mistakes and spreading misinformation, but you have people spreading disinformation on purpose in that platform. And you can't stop it because you've created this in a way for everybody to have a voice. And then the second thing you've done with these platforms is you really configured them around the idea of building connections, which is fundamentally different from building a platform to inform. You get a very different expectation if you say to somebody, let's go out on a date versus let's go out on a lecture, right? And so if you go to a dating platform, a platform that builds relationships, and you say, give me the best, driest, most fact-driven, authoritatively sourced information, nobody is going to engage with that. So, our view on this has been trying to fight fake news on Facebook is, like trying to fix or treat cancer with Band-Aids, right? It can't be done, right? Like you've got to actually get people out of that environment, give them a better environment to be in, where the raison d'etre and the entire organization and the entire initiative is built around actually informing people. And you have to make it a closed platform, so you only have vetted sources in there. And that's how you get around this, right? When you get to that point where more people start to use these kinds of services and get credible information, I think that's how you actually solve the problem.
I think the basic misinformation, though, the basic misinformation is that Facebook and Google and Twitter are content providers. They're not. They're distribution platforms. That's the basic misinformation.
I'd say even one further than that, they're not even distribution platforms. They're ad delivery devices.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Great.
Sean, I'd like to stay with you for a second. We've got a former economist on the panel. We've got someone who presents and produces a business podcast. What shifts have you seen in the business of news this year? Is it ownership models? Is it creative delivery? What have you noticed? What's here to stay?
Look, I think Australia has always been very economically literate, probably since Paul Keating days. You had a treasurer who was very loud, who kept talking about economics, and whether you liked it or not, you kept reading in the front page of the newspapers, and off we went. And so that's since the 1980s, and I'm sure things like budget deficits, inflation rates, and in fact I know ratings agencies and that, they don't get front page coverage in the US and most of Europe in general newspapers, but they do here. So we're a very literate economic society. I think this year it's been particularly so because people are losing jobs. Interest rates, your mortgage rates are incredibly low. Shops are closing. You've got to go online to buy goods. So suddenly we have taken a real interest in economics. But I think it ebbs and flows. And I suspect, and in some ways hope, that once we get through the pandemic and into 2021 and the second half of 2021 for sure, the whole interest in economics will fall off somewhat, and we'll actually get back to real, no, not real news, I shouldn't say that as an economist, but other news. If you take, for example, what's happened in Canberra cricket, that's right, the one-day series. If you take what's happened in Canberra this year, can anyone listening, watching, tell me 3 big events that happened in policy this year? Probably not. Can you give us 3 economic figures that happened this year? Yeah, absolutely you can. And I think, though, that is 2020 sort of wrapped up in a nutshell. Today, I know, well, yesterday the Foreign Relations Bill went through, and today the social media bill is supposed to go through, and the Industrial Relations Bill is going through in Canberra, or at least the legislation is being released. that's sort of the first big Canberra news I've really thought much about for about 6 or 8 months. Mostly it's been about health and economics. So I think hopefully going forward, we won't get as much of that, and we'll get a more diversity of news, including much more policy.
Much more policy. If we think about these continuing predictions or trends for 2021, Sean, what do you think the media opportunities are in 2021? Are they in delivery mechanisms like podcasts? You've hedged a few bets there, or are they in independent media brands, ownership models? What do you think?
Clearly podcasts. Now, I think it's really hard. I think it's been really hard to get cut through in 2020 when you're trying to get a news story out there, because it really has been dominated by COVID, health, economics, US election, that type of thing. Brands still matter. So being I think people forget about distribution. Lots of people create fantastic content and they don't know how to distribute it. They can you can do a podcast, right, and can go to 50 people in your business, but you're not really going to make a lot of sales from it. And this is for a person who, my life is about podcasts at the moment. I'm selling podcasts. So distribution really, really matters. And if to be distributed, if you're stuff.co, you've got, you're starting a long way in front of some other organisation. So I think that whole distribution piece, brand matters. You've just got to keep growing your audience all the time. You can't stand still. I'm sure the numbers out of the major media titles in Australia this year are better than ever, certainly in audience, probably not in revenue. And that's on the back of people wanting to get the news. But next year, when we have people won't want the news anywhere near as much. And in fact, there'll probably be a bit of fatigue, and you may actually see a fall off in people following news events because they're a bit over it all. If you don't have a brand name, I think you're really going to struggle. And, so maybe you have to hook on to a brand name to distribute, perhaps. I think that distribution thing is the real key, because creating content's hard, but you can get someone to do it. Distribution's really, really hard.
Keeping on thinking about audiences, the audience for this webinar today is predominantly made up of professional communicators, people in comms, PR. For anyone that's listening or watching today, I wanted to encourage you to add your questions into the questions area, because we will move into the audience-led section of this session soon. But what I wanted to ask first is, what should those people listening in be aware of when it comes to 2021? Ngaire, what have you seen that's relevant for communicators this year that you think people who need that awareness of content creation, of distribution, what should they be aware of?
I think the big thing for communicators right now is that if you haven't already reevaluated your audiences, make sure you do it soon. I think there are shifts in people's value systems that have happened in 2020. They may or may not be permanent, but they will have an impact on how people want to receive information, the type of things that they connect with, whether or not they're going to buy a particular thing. I talked a little bit earlier about companies needing to stand for something. All of those things are starting to influence how people want to consume or buy or change their behavior. And it's something that I do bang on about quite a lot, but upping your own consumption as a communicator, so upping your own consumption of information and news. I think in that context of misinformation, in the context of amplification, and also trying to find where your audiences are and what they care about, you need to think broad. You need to elevate your own consumption up a level, look at information that doesn't necessarily speak to your own personal values or your company values, and have a look at all of that information that's out there so that you can connect and make correlation between things that have gone really well for people, things that haven't gone really well for people. What are people reacting to? What do they get upset about? What are they outraged about?
Patrick, what would your advice be for some of those listeners or viewers today when someone is communicating with the media as a stakeholder moving into next year? What should people understand as something that has shifted? What should our audience be aware of today?
So I would circle back to your question earlier about how that live coverage of the daily press conferences has changed audience habits and expectations. And I would say increased transparency and a lower tolerance than ever, but from journalists and from our audience and from consumers, for anything that gets between them and the truth. So it's a great time to be the sort of communicator who focuses on being open and transparent and honestly and candidly telling the story of your organization and helping connect the right people together to do that.
Gautam, would you agree with that? What should those communicators know?
Well, I think, there's probably two ways that I would think about that. One is, I think there's been a long-term trend in the industry towards fragmentation and disaggregation of content. Right? And Sean made the point about how hard distribution is, and we're sort of really at the apex of this issue at the moment, because everybody has their own sort of path to market and their own ability to tell their own story. And I see that one of the things that's starting to happen is reaggregation, right? That people are starting to get together in smaller groups and say, okay, rather than just going out and doing this completely on my own, who can I bring? Are there like-minded people? And can we reaggregate and build new brands and focus on a niche and service a particular need that's unmet? So there's been this concept of news deserts, right? And so are there areas in the news that no one is covering where you can go and create a new brand and have a new voice, but you probably don't want to do it all on your own, so you go and find a few other people and do it. And we're seeing a lot of new brands doing that. The second thing is, I think the distance between the reader or the consumer and the brand has really collapsed, right? So even just 5 years ago, a major news brand would have very little idea who most of the people on that platform were, right? There were no logins, everyone was anonymous. And now, particularly because some of the technologies that we used in the past to sort of quasi-identify readers, things like cookies, right? Those are starting to disappear. So people are, the brands are building more direct connections, and you have to log in and you have to supply information. And so you're finding that news brands are actually getting a lot closer to their audience and much deeper understanding of their audience. And with that understanding, they can then also start to segment and treat different parts of the audience differently. So you've got the people, who are very likely to subscribe, and they almost become, so take a financial services metaphor, become like the private banking channel, right? These are your high value customers. They're going to pay you $200 a year. What additional bells and whistles can you give them? Can you give them exclusive stories, insider access? And then you sort of take that sort of segmentation model across the entire audience. So I think we'll see new brands coming into the market. And I think we'll also see the brands starting to treat readers differently depending on their understanding of who they're actually speaking to, which both of those I think are actually really good things for the industry. I'm probably one of the few people in the world who is very optimistic and bullish about news, because I sort of see the industry en masse moving towards higher quality and away from just mass distribution. And so I think it's actually going to be a really, really great year. Yes, consumption will probably drop compared to this year. That's also probably not a bad thing, actually. I think we've all probably read too much news, probably more than it's good for us.
What I'd love to do now is move into the audience Q&A section of our panel, of our discussion today. We've got a couple of questions coming in. There's one from Ali, and she has asked, given the crisis comms mode that the government and major players have been in for so much of this year due to COVID, are there any lessons to be learnt from operating that way for so long? I might throw over to you first on that one, Patrick.
I don't know. Depends. lessons for whom? Lessons for the comm staff rather than lessons for us as journalists. New Zealand has probably operated at a reduced version of that. It's still been a crisis throughout much of the year, but not as pronounced as in most countries. But I'm coming to you from my office today, which is full of staff sitting close to each other at desks, not wearing masks. I think I think one of the trends of next year will be the comm staff who have worked in those crisis environments needing to, or being forced to, let go of a little bit of message control. Because what they had done, in New Zealand at least, was with everything related to the COVID-19 response, it was all corralled into this one daily 1 p.m. press conference where you got a bunch of journalists in a room and they were able to ask questions after a long prepared statement was read. And that really limited the opportunities for inquiry. I think as the crisis conditions lapse, the ability of comm staff in the government to restrict those avenues and to control the message and control the timing of stories will also lapse, which I see as a good thing. They might not, and that, you know, that'll need to be navigated.
Clarifications come through from Ali, and she's interested in hearing more about who's done it well, what to avoid from that comm staff perspective. So Ngaire, you've been absorbing, researching, evaluating a lot of communication this year. What would be your take on who's done it well and what to avoid?
I think we've mentioned it a few times around transparency. Transparency has been huge, but I think it's probably the first example we've got of everyone trying to be transparent as a story evolves at the same time for everyone. I think there will be so many sociological studies on 2020 in terms of how information moved around the world, how everybody saw things differently. But I think from a really granular comms perspective, everyone had to enact some level of a crisis plan, being able to see whether or not that actually worked, understanding how your staff and your stakeholders want to receive information in a new world, thinking about how confused you were as a consumer of public health information. What did you see that wasn't effective? From my perspective, everything that worked was entirely around clarity, compassion and creativity. You had to be creative to get a message through. You had to be clear because it's public health information, and you had to lead with empathy. And it tended to be areas and governments and parts of the world that didn't do that are still kind of struggling with the information that's got out of control. So from a tactical perspective, that's what I've seen, but I think there's just going to be endless studies and views on things that worked and didn't, and I hope to produce some of them, and I hope that there will be thousands for me to consume as well.
It's been a great year for the experts in the room. You know, in New Zealand in particular, Dr. Ashley Bloomfield is the head of the Ministry of Health. His dryly factual style attracted a lot of fans. And then, you know, epidemiologists and scientists like Michael Baker and Susie Wiles, who have for years been honing their abilities in science communication as though they were training for this moment. And their skills, I think, have really shone in this period.
I actually think it's been a really weird. It's been a really weird year though, because there's been no conflict. So COVID, everyone pulled together, and everyone in Australia at least, and I think New Zealand's the same, followed health advice. The coalition versus Labor was sort of non-existent for most of the year. So as we go forward, that will all fall apart. Bipartisanship will fall apart. And like my one takeaway from a lot of this, and it's also going back to what Gautam was saying about the changing in the industry. If I'm a communications professional, the thing that I can do to get my story heard more than anything else, I reckon, is do the work for the journalist, because the journalists are really busy. So if you can come and it's feasibly practical things, give them a graphic, because I bet Patrick, every time he puts something up, he wants a graphic or a picture or some sort of visual element, right? So do that work for the journalist. Give them, you know, the stories today in today's papers in Australia that talk about for every $100 spent, $52 on Google and $28 on Facebook and digital advertising. Give that background information. So if you're trying to get your story out there and you're trying to go into niche media plays or whatever, do the work for the journalist. The journalist in the end will write the story, but I think that's actually a really good way of cutting through whatever's going to happen over the next 12 months.
Yeah,
So
to give a specific example of that, Sorry, just quickly.
Go
With
for it.
COVID in Australia, there were a number of individuals who identified a gap because the data that was coming out of the states, right? So one of the interesting things with the communication coming out of the government was that they didn't have the distribution process, the information distribution process buttoned down at the start. And so you had different numbers coming out at different times of the day with slightly different interpretations, right, in what they were reporting. And so what ended up happening is you had all these sort of individuals and, data scientists and journalists kind of starting to pull together. And there's a website called covidlive.com.au where, they started, it actually created a pretty big following just by bringing that data together. Right. And so exactly to Sean's point, if you see an opportunity there and you sort of know that people are going to be very data hungry and you can make sense of that, I think there's a real opportunity there. Right. And the other one is particularly this year, because there was so much uncertainty, I think there was a lot of interest in scenarios. Right. So there was overseas in the US, Our World in Data did a lot of work early on, very successfully, in really sort of trying to help people understand what the trends were and where things were heading and how many cases we were going to see. And they really shaped the entire narrative around flattening the curve. I mean, that's really where it started. It's from those guys. So again, I think there's a real opportunity there for, brands and communicators to say, well, what's the government missing out on here? And and if you can join those dots and start to work with the media organizations, I think there's a pretty interesting opportunity.
There's an interesting question that's come through from Lauren, which ties into Sean's earlier point about doing work for journalists where possible. And Lauren wanted to know Patrick's thoughts on supplied video from corporates. So where you are supplying a clip of someone talking to support a media release. Lauren says that she's been pretty successful with that to varying degrees, but she's really interested to know Patrick's thoughts on that and what works best for the stuff readers.
So we would treat that in the same way we would treat a text press release, which is we might quote from it. If we are compiling a video, we might take a section of it and incorporate that into a larger report. But if a reporter runs the whole thing with their byline on it, they should be shocked. So so to some degree, I'm aghast to hear that Lauren's had success with that, because I hope we're not taking those videos and running them whole. It is helpful to have, if we're getting quotes from someone, it's helpful to have them in a variety of different formats. We'd always prefer to be capturing those ourselves by talking to that person as a next best. Sure, if it's provided as video and text, we'll take a look at it, but we would want to be doing our own work around it.
Sean, what do you think about that? How does that apply to your experience in Australia?
A tough gig in New Zealand, right? If you're going to get shot for providing a video or for running a video, that's what I reckon. I agree. Like, provide all you can, but at the end of the day, the journalist, if they're decent, is going to do her or his own work. But having that as backup, I think you're not going to go wrong with it.
Awesome. All right, I might close out this panel today for go to each panelist and just ask for a 1 or 2 word answer, a trend to watch out for in 2021 for our audience today. Ngaire, I'll go to you first.
Oh, I think the one to watch for is, and we saw it a lot during lockdown around people not behaving in the right way, is always being aware of the opportunity to be videoed and the impact that may have on your own personal interactions or your company. I think there's been a lot of really interesting and somewhat complicated scenarios of cell phone videos and all of that stuff going viral. So while it was an issue before, another thing that has kind of sped up and amplified. So just always be aware of it.
Gautam, what's your trend for 2021 to keep an eye on?
I think there's going to be a schism between on a global level. There are some countries that are going to come out of this really well, and some countries that are just going to continue to struggle with this late into next year. And I think that's going to be a very unusual situation, because we're coming into it from an environment where there was, to a certain extent, sort of a global sort of, countries are largely running at pace, and what would happen in China would affect the US, and now all of a sudden you're going to see very, very different health outcomes in places like the UK versus India, for example. So I think there's going to be a really interesting schism when you look at how different countries navigate 2021.
And Sean, what are you keeping an eye on in 2021?
I'm going to give you an economics answer. I just don't think the Australian economy in the first 6 months of next year will be anywhere near as good as we're all hoping right now. And that's purely on the back of government payments at the moment holding up things. And as their demise continues, and by the 1st of April next year, most of us won't be receiving them. And that's really where the rubber hits the road.
And Patrick, what are you keeping an eye on? What should we be looking out for in New Zealand or globally in 2021?
So I'm going to say hangover. I think that for New Zealand media, the crunch around COVID accelerated a whole lot of trends that were already present and forced us to adapt really quickly. In some ways, for the broader economy, COVID has been less of a hit than anticipated. But I think there are going to be many unanticipated or as yet undiscovered effects on our industry, on our audience, on many other industries and on the country that we will be discovering as next year rolls on, even if that is just the sort of news fatigue that Sean and Gautam have spoken about earlier.
Awesome. Thank you so much to all of our panelists today, Ngaire, Patrick, Gautam and Sean. I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you to all of our audience members for tuning in, and we'll see you next year sometime. But thank you for coming and hanging out and having a wonderful conversation. See you in 2021.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
See you later.